It is impossible to imagine how different the history of the past century and a half would have been had any of the leading arbiters of world affairs, addressed by Baha'u'llah, spared time for reflection on a conception of reality supported by the moral credentials of its author, moral credentials of the kind they profess to hold in the highest regard. So wrote the Universal House of Justice, One Common Faith, 2005. This presentation attempts to be a short introduction to Baha'u'llah's letters to the kings and rulers in the late 1860s. It tries to say something about the letters, something about the recipients, and something about the families of those recipients. Time precludes it being very fulsome, and I hope that if you find it interesting, you will do your best to do further research. The story of the letters written by Baha'u'llah is really quite remarkable. He became a prisoner of the Persian monarchy in 1852 and then subsequently became a prisoner of the Ottoman monarchy, and therefore for most of his life from 1852 to 1892 he was a prisoner, and for all of it he was an exile. He was held by the Persian monarchy in an old cistern called the Black Pit under the Shah's palace. From there, every day, more and more of his fellow inmates and co-believers were hauled off to be executed. While in prison, he had a vision. While engulfed in tribulations, I heard a most wondrous, a most sweet voice calling above my head. I beheld a maiden, pointing with her finger unto my head. By God, this is the best beloved of the worlds, and yet ye comprehend not. This is the beauty of God amongst you, and the power of his sovereignty within you. Could ye but understand? This is the mystery of God and his treasure. He later explained that he felt as if a stream of knowledge came to him and taught him everything. He survived the Black Pit and was exiled from Iran in 1853. From here he was repeatedly moved on to new exiles. He spent 4 years in Baghdad, 2 years as a hermit in the mountains of Kurdistan, and after 4 more years in Baghdad he was summoned by the Sultan's leading ministers to the Ottoman capital, Istanbul. On the journey he was escorted by Ottoman soldiers. Just before his departure, he was feted by the people of the city, much like the way that Christ was feted on Palm Sunday. And Baha'u'llah here declared publicly that he was the manifestation of God for this age. But in Istanbul he just gained more and more followers, and he was forcibly exiled yet again to the pre-Istanbul capital of the Ottoman Empire, Edirne, in southeast Europe. Now Edirne is just inside Turkey on the border with Bulgaria, but at the time it was well within the Ottoman Empire. Finally, in 1868, he was sent to the most severe prison in the entire Ottoman Empire, Akka, a walled city inhabited only by condemned criminals and their keepers. He called the citadel there the most great prison. This map shows the exiles of Baha'u'llah. The greenish territory is that of the Persian Empire at the time, and the dark brown shows the extent of the Ottoman, or as we would say now, Turkish Empire. So how did a prisoner in the Ottomans' toughest prison write to the kings and rulers of the world. Not just write to them, but comment upon their motivation and sometimes rebuke them. Even the strictest governors of the city came to admire him and took his advice. How he was viewed in the city can be discerned by what eyewitness Salah Jarrah said of Baha'u'llah's son Abdul between 1892 and 1908. He was a prisoner, but the king of Akka. The same was probably even more true of Baha'u'llah. The governors and the leading men basically deferred to him after they had got to know him. It's fair to ask, why did he not write to the rulers of Asia and Africa? By 1885, less than 2 decades after the letters were written, the vast majority of territories in the 2 continents would be controlled by Europeans. Those to whom he wrote could have changed the world at this point had they listened to him. This picture shows the prison city of Akka. Baha'u'llah and his family arrived there through the sea gate from a ship. The idea of sending him to Akka was to make him completely forgotten by his followers and by the world in general. This city, originally built by the Crusaders, was such a stronghold that even Napoleon the Great, Napoleon I, had found himself unable to take it in 1799. First they were taken to the citadel, which is shown in this picture, and 73 of them spent a couple of years in 2 small rooms. When Baha'u'llah and his family arrived in 1868, inhabitants gathered to jeer at the prisoners. They might be murderers, but the newcomers were heretics, which was much worse. Baha'u'llah's daughter recalled, all the townspeople had assembled to see the arrival of the prisoners. Having been told that we were infidels, criminals, and sowers of sedition, the attitude of the crowd was threatening. Their yelling of curses and execrations filled us with fresh misery. We were terrified of the unknown. We knew not what the fate of our party, the Friends, and ourselves would be. We were taken to the old fortress of Akka, where we were crowded together. There was no air. A small quantity of very bad coarse bread was provided. We were unable to get fresh water to drink. Our sufferings were not diminished. Then an epidemic of typhoid broke out. Nearly all became ill. Baha'u'llah explains that as they entered the city, he heard a voice say, "Soon will all that dwell on earth be enlisted under these banners." I'm going to say something about the nature of the letters. They were written variously between 1867 and 1871 to a range of world leaders. These included kings, a single letter to all the presidents of the American republics, and 2 chief ministers. He also wrote letters to kings and rulers in general, urging them to take counsel together and to create world peace. It's insufficient just to ask, what did he say to X? Every letter is a masterpiece and includes theology, advice on creating world peace, and often an account of the treatment of the Baha'is and their children in their various exiles. By the close of the scramble for Africa in 1887, these monarchs were to rule most of the world. It's important to realize that even though some of these monarchs received an element of criticism, the Blessed Beauty was usually kind and polite. For instance, he said to Napoleon III, in a letter in which he foretold that he would be losing his throne, "It is not our wish to address thee words of condemnation, out of regard for the dignity we conferred upon thee in this mortal life. How were the letters delivered? The letter to the Shah was delivered through Badi. Badi was a young man who really had not found himself, and through meeting Baha'u'llah at the age of 17, he became born again and desired very much to deliver this letter. When he arrived outside Tehran, he waited where he knew the Shah would pass on his way to a hunting expedition, and he called out to the Shah using a quotation from the Quran about the relationship between Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. O King, I come to you from Sheba with a weighty message. Whether the Shah ever knew the contents of this letter, we don't know, because his attendants seized Badi, tortured him and put him to death. Most of the letters were delivered through consuls. It's alleged that the French consul became a believer. They were mostly written in Arabic, which were received, I don't know that. Most were written in 1868 to 69. The letter to the Shah and the letters to the Turkish chief ministers were written either in Edirne or en route from Edirne to Akka. That to the Emperor of Germany was clearly written in 1871. We can tell this because it refers to the fall of Napoleon III as already having happened. In November 1868, a new American president was elected, Ulysses Grant, to replace Andrew Johnson. We assume that it was President Grant who took office in March 1869. There's always been a delay between the election and entry into office, who actually received this letter. This map shows Europe as it was in 1868. You will notice there are several multinational empires which are not quite as large these days. The Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and there are other slight differences from today. You will see that the area around Rome was not part of Italy. You will see that the southern German states were separate from Prussia, which was the biggest power in Germany. You will also note that the Republic of Ireland was then part of the United Kingdom. The first monarch to which I'm going to refer is Pius IX, the Pope. You might think it strange to talk of him as a monarch, but in fact he was also the ruler of the Papal States, which was a kingdom which had been built up in the name of the papacy several hundred years previously, and the Pope was an absolute monarch within that kingdom. He was humorously called Pio Nono, which is an Anglo-Italian pun. Pio Nono meaning Pius IX in Italian, and Pio Nono fitting in both Italian, English and French, meaning pious who negates everything. This shows you a map of the Kingdom of Italy in 1867. You will note that, like all good nationalists, the Italian nationalists claimed also things that didn't belong to them. Notice the Swiss admin zone, in other words, Switzerland. Notice also Corsica, which had actually been part of France for 100 years and actually had been the birthplace of the French Emperor Napoleon I. notice also the area around Rome, which is all that's left of the Papal States. The rest had only recently been united between 1860 and 1866. There were really three stages of the life of Pius IX. Before 1848, Pius was a modernizer and an advocate of constitutional monarchy. The Italian nationalists asked him to lead Italy and indeed to take the field to drive the Austrians out of Lombardia and the Veneto. In 1848 and 49 occurred the Year of Revolutions. In this year, the capitals of most European cities were overtaken by rebellions or demonstrations. In Rome, the Italian nationalists Mazzini and Garibaldi took control of Rome and the Papal States in the name of a united Italy. Almost immediately, the French president, later Emperor, Napoleon Bonaparte, sent troops to restore the Pope to his throne, and the Pope became an arch-conservative. In 1860, the King of Sardinia defeated the Papal army and declared himself King of Italy, taking most of the Papal States and leaving only the city of Rome in Papal hands. This he could not take because of the French troops being there. After 1870, after Napoleon III had received a letter from Baha'u'llah, and after Pius IX had received his letter, France invaded Prussia and was pushed back, and the Prussians then invaded France. Napoleon III withdrew his troops to protect France, and the Italians marched in and incorporated Rome as their capital. Thus began the third stage of Pius's life. He called himself the prisoner of the Vatican. A council of cardinals declared him infallible on doctrine. He interfered to a considerable extent in the Kingdom of Italy. He wrote to the king opposing free universal education in a country that was 75% illiterate. In 2000, he became beatified, not yet a saint, but on the way there. Now, some of you will probably respond that I've got it wrong because there is an independent Vatican City today. But this only dates to the Concordat between Mussolini and the papacy in 1929. Between 1870 and 1929, what is now the Vatican was part of Italy. What were the main points of the message? As I've said, it's probably unwise for any ordinary person to choose what's the main points of the message. So I trust you will forgive me if I can only deal with those points which I think to be most worthy of note, but it would be rude of me and presumptive to assume that I know everything, and particularly not to provide Baha'u'llah's message in its entirety. So I advise you, if you're interested in this, to read it. The Lord of Lords is come overshadowed with clouds. He hath come again down from heaven, even as he came down from it the first time. He said that Jesus lived in poverty, and the Pope doesn't need his palaces. He says to the Pope, abandon thy kingdom unto the kings. He talks of how the Pharisees disputed with Jesus, and asked the Pope not to do the same with Baha'u'llah, and to warn peoples of all faiths of the parallel. He also uses this message to the Pope to address Christians in general and monks and nuns in general. He tells the Pope that Christ has predicted his coming. Thus do we make plain unto you the path of him whom the Spirit prophesied. I verily bear witness unto you, even as he hath borne witness unto me. Verily he said, Come ye after me, and I will make you to become fishers of men. In this day, however, we say, Come ye after me, that we may make you to become quickeners of mankind. Thus hath the decree been inscribed in this tablet by the pen of revelation. The next monarch to whom I would wish to refer is Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of France, or as he put it, in tribute to his uncle, Napoleone di Buonaparte, who also changed his name to Napoleon Bonaparte to sound more French, who called himself Emperor of the French from 1804 onwards. Napoleon III was a truly remarkable man. His father was King Louis I of Holland, one of Napoleon I's many brothers. On the death of Napoleon's son, Napoleon II, Louis Napoleon became the Bonapartist claimant, and many people in France who were neither Republicans nor supporters of the return of the Bourbon monarchy wanted Bonaparte's back. They had enjoyed the combination of glory and liberalism that Napoleon I had given them, and they were looking for a return of this dynasty. So Napoleon III, as he eventually became, Louis Napoleon, was the Bonapartist claimant, and in the 1830s he organised a very small invasion of France, which didn't work, and he was imprisoned for rebellion. Having escaped, he worked as a docker in New York City, supplementing his income by winning foot races for money. In 1848, with the year of revolutions, he thought perhaps his hour had come, and was right. He came first to London and worked as a special constable during the Chartist demonstrations of that year. With the abdication of the second Bourbon monarch after the ouster of Napoleon, Louis Philippe, Louis Bonaparte moved to France and stood for election for president of the new Second Republic, which he won. In 1851, he carried out a coup and declared himself Emperor, Napoleon III. Why did he not choose Napoleon II? Because even though Napoleon I's son never came to the throne, he would have been Napoleon II had he done so. And if Napoleon III was in any sense legitimate, it was as successor of Napoleon II. Once you've made yourself an emperor, the first thing you need is a noble and attractive wife, even if that wife is infinitely younger than you are. Napoleon I had done this, marrying the daughter of the Emperor of Austria in 1809 or 1810, and Napoleon III did the same and married a Spanish princess. They made something of a glittering couple. You've all seen photographs of Queen Victoria at this time looking rather dowdy. The Empress Eugenie was the opposite. She was very fashionable, and they had a very nice summer palace. And she was basically #1 female celebrity of her day. Napoleon III was the supreme meddler. I'm not saying to you that Mark Twain understood people. And in this talk, I'm going to give you examples of both what he said about Napoleon III and Sultan Aziz, neither of which are particularly flattering. I'm not saying that this is necessarily true, I'm just saying that's how one of the greatest writers in the English language viewed them when he saw them both in Paris. Napoleon in military uniform, a long-bodied, short-legged man, fiercely mustachioed, old, wrinkled, with eyes half closed, and such a deep, crafty, scheming expression about them. Napoleon, bowing ever so gently to the loud plaudits, and watching everything and everybody with his cat eyes from under his depressed hat brim, as if to discover any sign that those cheers were not heartfelt and cordial. He actually did a lot to modernize France. He rebuilt Paris with very broad boulevards. This was not just in order to make it look beautiful. He also noted that in 1789, 1830 and 1848, previous monarchs had been brought down by the Paris mob, putting up barricades and rebelling against them. These boulevards were far too wide for barricades. He rearmed France, although he didn't particularly modernize the armament. It was soon considered the most powerful country in Europe. His main problem in foreign policy was that he was always interfering against the country and then tried to win their friendship back again, and therefore developed an impression, among others, of being two-faced. He helped the Italian nationalists drive the Austrians out of Lombardy in 1859 and Venetia in 1866. But, as we've already seen, he drove them out of Rome, kept them from Rome, and when eventually he allowed the unification of Italy, he required that Italy surrender Savoy and Nice, part of the kingdom of Sardinia that would otherwise have gone into Italy, to become French. Garibaldi, who had been born in Nice, said to Napoleon III, "You have made me a foreigner in the land of my birth." Britain and France went to war with Russia to help the Turks in the Crimean War, 1853-54. Napoleon III, trying to get the Austrians back on his side after the Lombardy and Venetia, invaded Mexico and put an Austrian Prince Maximilian von Habsburg on the throne. When President Lincoln and then President Johnson threatened the French to remove their troops, he did so, and this allowed the Mexican nationalists to rebel against the Emperor Maximilian, and he was executed. Napoleon III, like many would-be populists, played the religious card. He bullied the Coptic, Orthodox and Muslim authorities in Jerusalem to allow Roman Catholic monks shared custodianship of the Christian holy places. Baha'u'llah sent two messages to Napoleon III, the first of which, as Baha'u'llah put it, Napoleon cast behind him contemptuously. It is rumoured that he said, "If this man is God, I am two gods," but I cannot verify that. He spoke to Napoleon in this second letter, as he did to the Pope, of how Christ had been missed by many at the time, and urged that the same mistake should not be made. He told the king, the emperor, that Napoleon III's statement to the Tsar that the Crimean War was about protecting the oppressed was untrue, and that God knew it to be untrue. "We tested thee and found thee wanting." And he warned him thus, "For what thou hast done, thy kingdom shall be thrown into confusion, and thine empire shall pass from thine hands, as a punishment for that which thou hast wrought." he urges him, look after the poor, care for your people. He laid some duties upon all people, using the letter to Napoleon III as an illustration. We have ordained that our cause be taught through the power of utterance. In the wake of this message, Napoleon III certainly experienced a rapid demotion. In 1870, the year after Napoleon received the letter, France and Prussia fell out over the Spanish throne. And in July 1870, France declared war on Prussia, reassured by Napoleon's advisors that France would win and that Napoleon would become extremely popular in the country once again. He had not, in fact, become unpopular. A recent referendum gave him well over 70% of the vote, but because he was obsessed with being as popular as his uncle, he thought this was insufficient. If you look at contemporary commentators about this war, look for instance at copies of the Times, which you can get online or at the Public Record Office in Kew, you will see that British commentators thought that France would win very easily, largely because of the size of the army. No such luck. The other German states, Bavaria and Baden-Württemberg being the biggest of them, backed Prussia because France was the aggressor. The Germans also, already having a plan and having lots more railways, mobilised much more quickly than the French and outmanoeuvred them. Napoleon III and an army of over 100,000 soldiers were surrounded and captured at Sedan in northeastern France. His own soldiers blamed him and some of them spat at him. He came to Britain, living for a year in Leamington Spa, and then moved to Chislehurst, where he passed away in 1873. Eugenie, who actually told her friends that she considered Napoleon III disgusting, he was, after all, much, much older than she was, treated him like a secular saint after his death. And she established a convent and abbey in Farnborough, Hampshire, at which she, her husband, and their son are now buried. Their only son, the Prince Imperial, was killed in 1879 when serving in the British Army in the Zulu War. Queen Victoria was heartbroken because even though she appreciated probably that the Bonapartes were to some extent usurpers from the Bourbons, nevertheless, after almost 100 years, they were, in her view, acceptable royals, and she had hoped that the Prince Imperial would go back to France and become emperor in turn, and obviously would be a good friend to Britain, having been brought up here. The next monarch to whom I wish to refer is Alexander II, the Tsar of all the Russias. Baha'u'llah's letter to him is very short but very positive. He was a member of the House of Romanov, which ruled the Russian Empire from 1613 until 1917. There were several reasons why Baha'u'llah was so positive about him. First of all, Alexander's ambassador had interceded with the Shah to save Baha'u'llah from execution when he was in the Black Pit. Secondly, Alexander II had freed the serfs in 1861. Ironically, just 2 years before Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation freeing slaves in the US. He made Russia a much more normal and constitutional country, although it was still pretty authoritarian. He introduced courts, local government, elections, and abolished corporal punishment. Unfortunately, this liberalisation did not make him universally popular, and there were 6 attempts on his life, the 6th in 1881 proving successful. What happened to his family? His grandson Nicholas II and his whole nuclear family were murdered by their communist captors in Ekaterinburg in the Urals in 1918. The next monarch to which I wish to refer is Queen Victoria. The message to Queen Victoria was quite pleasant. He first shows how he fulfills biblical prophecies, as he did at the beginning of his letters to the Pope and to Napoleon III. He then moves on to congratulate her thus: "Thou hast forbidden the trading in slaves, both men and women. This verily is what God hath enjoined in this wondrous revelation." In one sense, of course, both the British abolition of the international slave trade in 1806, entering into force in 1807, and the abolition of slavery within the British Empire in 1833 predated Queen Victoria's coming to the throne in 1837. But Victoria, and indeed her husband Prince Albert, did a lot to put pressure on successive British governments to make sure that any treaties they made with other powers required the abolition of slavery. Baha'u'llah then goes on to congratulate Queen Victoria on constitutional monarchy. "Thou hast entrusted the reins of counsel into the hands of the people. Thou indeed hast done well. O ye the elected representatives of your people in every land, take ye counsel together, and let your concern be only for that which profiteth mankind." He then uses the letter, as he does some of the other letters, to speak more broadly to everybody. "That which the Lord hath ordained as the sovereign remedy and mightiest instrument for the healing of all the world is the union of all its peoples in one universal cause, one common faith." He then addresses all kings through Queen Victoria. "O kings of the earth, we see you increasing every year your expenditures and laying the burden thereof on your subjects. Your people are your treasures. By them ye rule, by their means ye subsist, by their aid ye conquer. Yet how disdainfully you look upon them. How strange, how very strange." And then again: "Be united, O kings of the earth, for thereby will the tempest of discord be stilled amongst you, and your peoples find rest. Should any one of you take up arms against another, rise ye all against him, for this is naught but manifest justice." This, in a way, seems to be a precursor of the collective security which came in with the United Nations Charter in 1945. Another monarch to whom Baha'u'llah wrote was the Shah of Persia, Nasiri'd-Din Shah. As I have explained, this letter was taken by a 17-year-old man who was put to death for his pains. You will note that the Shah was a much decorated man. The tablet to the Shah is written in 1867 and sent from Medina rather from Akka. As well as being a letter, it's also a literary masterpiece. "Whither are gone the learned men, the divines and potentates of old? What hath become of their discriminating views, their shrewd perceptions, their subtle insights and sage pronouncements? Where are their hidden coffers, their flaunted ornaments, their gilded couches, their rugs and cushions strewn about?" He's polite and respectful despite the fact that this monarch has been responsible for the deaths of many of his friends, and that this monarch and his predecessor had also been responsible for much suffering to Baha'u'llah himself. "With thy love in my heart, nothing can ever alarm me." Very similar to what he says to the Sultan: "Have I, O king, ever disobeyed thee?" He tells the Shah of the suffering and executions of his friends, and points out that most of those who criticize him and his teachings had never met him or ever read his writings. He then quotes from Christian and Muslim prophecy to show to the Shah how he fulfills them. And another monarch to whom Baha'u'llah wrote was his current jailer, Abdul Aziz, servant of the beloved, the current Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, and also the Caliph of Sunni Islam. He also wrote to the chief ministers, by whom he was very unimpressed. He lists their failures, he lists their corruption, accuses them of disdain for the people, talks of their speeches as being just grumping and barking and having no value, and he accuses them of allowing a plague in Constantinople to flourish. In the letter to the Shah, he'd called the Sultan the King of Islam, probably because the Sultans claimed to be Caliphs of Islam. They had claimed to be this right since the 1200s, but after they defeated the Fatimids from Egypt, they then were able to be uninterrupted Caliphs of Islam, and they were generally regarded as such. And in the letter to the Sultan, he also says that this tablet includes general advice to all monarchs. He asks, as I said before, "Have I, O king, ever disobeyed thee?" He also says, warning the Sultan of the kind of people that the Sultan has appointed as his chief ministers. "Beware, O king, that thou gather not around thee such ministers as follow the desire of a corrupt inclination. Know thou for a certainty that whoso disbelieveth in God is neither trustworthy nor truthful." He also tells the Sultan that the way in which the chief minister had had his home in Edirne surrounded and forbidding food coming in and out, and therefore the children suffering, was not acceptable. No faith or religion has ever held children responsible. And I am reminded when I see this of the way in which Abdul, his son, later gave such encouragement to the Save the Children Fund. He reminds the Sultan that there were more important things than wealth. "Place not thy reliance on thy treasures," similar to the letter to the Pope. He also reminds the Sultan that he has a very strong responsibility. "Thou art God's shadow upon earth." Mark Twain, who, as I said, had the opportunity to see both the Sultan and Napoleon III together, was rude about him as well as Napoleon III. I'm not in any way suggesting that the Sultan wasn't a truly marvellous person. I'm just quoting the way he looked to Mark Twain. This is in Mark Twain's book, The Innocents Abroad. Abdul Aziz, absolute lord of the Ottoman Empire, clad in dark green European clothes, almost without ornament or insignia of rank. A red Turkish fez on his head. A short, stout, dark man. Black-bearded, black-eyed, stupid, unprepossessing. A man whose whole appearance somehow suggested that if he only had a cleaver in his hand and a white apron on, one would not at all be surprised to hear him say, "A mutton roast today, or will you have a nice porterhouse steak?" The representative of a people by nature and training filthy, brutish, ignorant, unprogressive, superstitious, and a government whose three graces are tyranny, rapacity, blood. Born to a throne, weak, stupid, ignorant almost as his meanest slave, who sleeps, eats, idles with his 800 concubines, who found his great empire a blot upon the earth, a degraded, poverty-stricken, miserable, infamous agglomeration of ignorance, crime and brutality, and will idle away the allotted days of his trivial life, and then pass to the dust and the worms and leave it so. As I say, I'm not saying this is true, I'm just saying this is how Mark Twain viewed it. Mark Twain was certainly right about one thing. He took his harem very seriously. One of the finest buildings in the palace was the barracks in which the ladies were kept. One of the chief ministers to whom Baha'u'llah wrote was Fuad Pasha. As I said before, he wasn't very flattering to the two chief ministers of the Sultan. He accused him of corruption, and he also listed what these corruption acts were. He calls him chief throughout. It details how Ali Pasha had sent troops to surround Baha'u'llah's house and denied food to the people inside. Now, he called the land around Edirne the land of mystery. Why he does so is, to me, a mystery. But more of that later. This is Ali Pasha, the Prime Minister of Fuad Pasha and of the Sultan. Here's another map showing Europe as it was then. The reason I show you this is because you can see that the Ottoman Empire went quite a long way into what is now the Balkans, Southeast Europe. Bulgaria, Serbia, Macedonia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Albania, Kosovo, Slovenia, Croatia were all in the Ottoman Empire, and Romania, which had recently got its independence, albeit on slightly different boundaries from today, was somewhat independent, but was still subject to the Sultan's overlordship. Baha'u'llah, in this letter, prophesies about the land around Edirne. The day is approaching when the land of mystery and what is beside it shall be changed, and shall pass out of the hand of the king, and commotions shall appear, and the voice of lamentation shall be raised, and the evidence of mischief shall be revealed on all sides. And confusion shall spread by reason of that which have befallen these captives at the hands of the hosts of oppression. The course of things shall be so altered, and the conditions shall wax so grievous, that the very sands on the desolate hills will moan, and the trees on the mountain will weep. And did they wax grievous? 5 different wars affected Edirne in the next 5 decades. The city was occupied by the Russians in 1877, by the ensuing peace in 1878. All the land to the north and west of Edirne was lost to the Ottomans. Only the city was eventually handed back, and what had been the capital for several hundred years before Istanbul became a border town. In 1913 to 1923, the Turks lost it again, but eventually got it back in 1923. And as for conditions waxing grievous, even as the late 1990s, petty nationalism was costing large numbers of human lives in the Balkans. There were many problems with having 800 concubines, one of which is it clouds the succession issue. After Aziz was deposed by his ministers and then found dead, i.e. murdered secretly, you will note that 4 successive nephews each had short rules. In 1908, Abdul II was dethroned by the Young Turk Rebellion, which also freed the Baha'is from prison. And eventually, in 1918, Abdulaziz's son, Abdul II, became the Caliph, and the Caliphate was abolished in 1924. The next monarch to whom I'd like to refer is Franz Joseph II, the Emperor of Austro-Hungary. The von Habsburgs, of which he was a member, was the longest established ruling house, taking its name from a castle in Switzerland, and it was established in 1020. The male line died out in 1740, and the house became the House of Habsburg-Lorraine. Its greatest talent was for marrying for land. At their height, the von Habsburgs and the Habsburg-Lorraines ruled much of South America. They ruled Austria, they ruled Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, half of Italy, and for 400 years they held the title of Holy Roman Emperor, which was an elective title. As the Turks weakened in the late 1700s, the Habsburgs conquered Hungary, parts of Poland, Bosnia, etc. The big problem for the von Habsburgs was that in trying to keep the land in the same family, they intermarried with relatives, and it produced a large number of disabled offspring. Franz Joseph was the last Habsburg monarch. Baha'u'llah wrote him only a short letter, regretting that on his visit to the Holy Land the emperor had not inquired about the Blessed Beauty. He made no prophecies to him. Sadly, the history of the Habsburg family after this was very sad, and indeed before this. Franz Joseph's brother Maximilian was the Emperor of Mexico, put in power by Napoleon III and executed by the Mexicans in 1867. The Emperor's son Rudolf committed suicide in 1889, and his nephew Franz Ferdinand, Archduke, was assassinated in 1917 by Princip, a Serb nationalist at Sarajevo in Bosnia, which of course is one of the causes of the First World War. The next monarch to which I'd like to refer is Wilhelm I von Hohenzollern, Kaiser of Germany. The Hohenzollerns prospered through science and militarism, and territorial expansion was a royal obsession right from the establishment of the house in the 1500s. They started off as the margraves of a rather small territory called the Margrave of Brandenburg. With military expansion, they took Prussia and became kings of Prussia. One of the greatest of the kings of Prussia stole Silesia from Austria by marching into it as a surprise raid and then offering to pay for it. And the kings of Prussia also partitioned Poland with the Tsar and the Austrian Emperor successively from 1772. With the Waterloo settlement, after the fall of Napoleon I, Prussia gained more land and in 1866 seized land from Denmark. It used rivalry with Austria and France to persuade the small German states to seek the protection of Prussia, and after the fall of Napoleon III, it proclaimed the German Empire and they proclaimed themselves Emperors of Germany. Here's Wilhelm I with his Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. They loved dressing up in uniforms and reviewing troops. His message to Wilhelm is quite short. He reminds him of the fact that Napoleon III had been viewed as the most powerful monarch in Europe, and although Wilhelm I probably felt pretty proud of himself for having vanquished him, this pride could lead his family also into a lot of trouble, as indeed it was to do later. Baha'u'llah says, "Take heed, lest pride debar thee from recognizing the dayspring of divine revelation. Do thou remember the one whose power transcended thy power, and whose station excelled thy station? Where is he? He it was who cast the tablet of God behind him. Wherefore disgrace assailed him from all sides." He then makes prophecies about the first war and the second war. O banks of the Rhine, we have seen you covered with gore, inasmuch as the swords of retribution were drawn against you. And you shall have another turn. And we hear the lamentations of Berlin, though she be today in conspicuous glory. This photo shows the fulfillment of this prophecy when Berlin was divided into two halves, east and west, after the Berlin airlift of 1848 until 1990. Both Kaiser Wilhelm II, this Kaiser's grandson, and Emperor Franz Joseph were deposed by their people at the end of the First World War. Until 1966, the Constitution of Austria denied the right to any von Habsburg to enter the country. Now, his late father having renounced any claim to the throne, Karl von Habsburg, who still uses the title Archduke of Austria, serves as an Austrian MP and was formerly a German MEP. The last Kaiser, Wilhelm II, lived until 1940. There is still a Hohenzollern Prince of Prussia, but he has no right to any prerogatives. This is a brief introduction to a massive subject. I hope you will wish to explore it further. Most of the letters appear in the Summons of the Law of Host. I welcome comments, and I've got my email here.